Okay, now we're rolling with Torah portion Eikev. And what I'd like to do today is pull some more things out of the Torah portion that relate to the lesson from last night that we had over Workbook 2, where we basically didn't move much farther than we had the week before, but we went back to the creature that is described as being able to torment people for 5 months, and they'll want to die, but they won't be able to figure out how to do it, which is kind of a strange thing, because not, to dwell on death or anything, but having worked where I worked for a long time, I've seen that you don't have to be that creative to figure out how to die. There's lots of ways to do it. And for the average person, it's easy. You can walk off a bridge. You can walk off a building. You can shoot yourself. You can overdose. You can, I even saw a guy one time who was so determined that he not be stopped. He took a long buffer cord and tied it to the top rail of a multi-tier dormitory, tied it around his neck, slit both of his wrists properly, not sideways. Properly is probably not a great description, but anyway, effectively. And then he jumped. So at the very same time, he was hanging himself, and he had cut 2 places that were going to bleed out fairly quickly, with the idea that we could never get all those things solved at one time in order to stop him. And even in cells where people are on suicide watch, they can still manage to do it unless someone has got eyes on them 24/7. So the idea that people would want to die for 5 months and they wouldn't be able to figure out how to, yeah, you're interesting too. They wouldn't be able to figure out how to do that is pretty incredible. So it tells you that there's a great degree of confusion that is introduced with this creature that is described as being like, it's not exactly a locust, but it's described as being like a locust. And in last night's class, we went through the tzira that's mentioned in this Torah portion and what it could possibly be. We went back to some of the rabbinic sources that describe how it worked. That it would, at the same time, blind you and make you impotent. And in English, sometimes it's translated not just as locust, but as hornet. An interesting sort of creature, because we can tell from the description in Revelation, it's definitely got some supernatural attributes to it. But I want to go back to the Torah portion today and try to bring out some more things with holding on to those same themes from last night concerning the supernatural judgments of Revelation, because I believe they're prophesied very specifically in these Torah portions. And we'll look at some of these prophecies. I think that some of the best news we have is in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy. And it's on the good news side of things, where it says in verse 13, he will love you, he will bless you, he will multiply you, he will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land, your grain, your wine, your oil, the offspring of your cattle, and the herds of your flock on the land that he swore to your forefathers to give you. And I think we can agree by this point that it's not just the physical land that was sworn to be given to the descendants of Abraham, but as a restoration to the garden, that sort of land that is also promised to the offspring of Abraham. And like Yeshua said, if you're children of Abraham, then you need to be doing the works of Abraham. And this Torah portion reinforces that obeying the commandments does prolong your days in the land, and rebelling against them not only does it get you expelled from the land, but other forces grow stronger in that place, which makes it that much harder when you repent and return to go back and to overcome those things. And it's all just an expression, I believe, of unbelief, lack of faith, that we really can transform through the power of Yeshua. And I want to take us back to this verse here where it says, the offspring of your cattle. That's an interesting word that's used there. And the base word there is aloof, which is being which is being translated here as cattle in the English in this particular translation. But aloof, you can recognize aleph, because aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew aleph beit, and it means the chief, or the highest, the one in charge, like the general, right? But it also has some interesting other meanings that I would like for you to see. If I can do a screen share with you, I want to show you something. Here we go. All right. It takes us back to Proverbs 2:10-7. And it says, for wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you. Understanding will watch over you, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. And by the way, if you're picking up on the creation gospel paradigm here, you can see wisdom, you can see knowledge, you can see understanding. So it's discussing the spiritual aspects of your walk. And basically it's saying a transformation of the soul. Because at this point, when the evil inclination that we fight against, when it encounters the spiritual things within the commandments, it's not always pleasant to our soul. Sometimes it grieves our soul when there's a commandment that we really don't want to keep in our heart of hearts, and it's still in that process of being transformed. But he's saying when you engage it with the Spirit, it's going to transform, and it's actually going to be pleasant to your soul to be obedient, to keep the commandments. And so it says discretion will guard you, understanding will watch over you, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things, from those who leave the paths of righteousness, of uprightness, to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways, to deliver you from the strange woman, from the adulteress who flatters with her words. And if you'll go back to last night's lesson, you'll see it seems like everything keeps going back to the words, either the false words or the word of truth. There's a contrast there. So the strange woman, we see her in the book of Revelation. We see the harlot. We see the adulteress. It says, who flatters with her words. And that's exactly what is told to the assembly at Thyatira, that there's this woman that's being called Jezebel, who is teaching and leading the servants astray. How is she doing that? With words, which, as we've seen in context, is exactly how the Midianite women seduced the Israelite men into not just adultery, but into idolatry. They flattered them with their words. And then it gives us a little bit more information about this adulteress. And at this point, we're going to realize that the adulteress doesn't just stand for females, it stands for Israel, whether male or female. It says that leaves the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. So the definition of an adulteress as we're looking at this context of spiritual things, someone who is becoming a spiritual adulterer is leaving the companion of youth. In other words, that first love that the church at Ephesus is urged to go back to. Go back to your first love. Go back to the companion of your youth. And then it even explains what that means. So we don't have to speculate, well, what does it mean to leave the companion of your youth? It says, and forgets the covenant of her God. So, an adulteress will use words in order to turn people away from the covenant with God. And the covenant we know was forged. There were actually several covenants that were forged. The one that we focus on the most that seems to embody them is the covenant made at Sinai, the covenant of the Torah, so that Israel would be a light to the nations, so that they would be the light of the world. And so this spiritual force that works against the Holy Spirit is one that will entice you to leave the companion of your youth, to forget the covenant of your God. And in that context, the word there, companion of youth, is Strong's 441. That particular word is aloof. All right, and so that's one thing we want to keep in mind when we look at, we have the same word here being used for the offspring of your cattle. All right, let's look at another definition. Let's go to the middle quotation there, Jeremiah 11:19. It says, but I was like a gentle lamb. The word there is aloof. So now we can see where they got the translation of cattle, because typically when they're translating into English, if they say cattle, it's going to mean sheep and goats. We tend, in the United States, we tend to think of cattle as all cows. If you're out on the cattle range, then you're out herding cows. You're not herding sheep and lambs and goats and things. So when we're reading this in English, it's actually translated out of generations that are kind of getting clouded here in terms of what we understand these things to be. But typically, your cattle is going to consist mainly of goats and of sheep. And here in Jeremiah, he says, I was like a gentle lamb, aloof, led to the slaughter, and I did not know that they had devised plots against me, saying, let us destroy the tree with its fruit, and let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name be remembered no more. Now remember that language, because that language is going to pop up again, not just in this Torah portion, but in the book of Revelation, which is mirroring or explaining the fulfillment of much of the prophecy of what this Torah portion is saying. So it's a messianic prophecy. We know who the gentle lamb led to the slaughter was. That was Yeshua. And it says what they're saying is destroy the tree with its fruit. That should take us back to the action of this supernatural bug that's released in Revelation. Because according to the rabbis, they did two things. They would blind you. They would make it where you could not see. And their other point of torment had to do with making you impotent, infertile. So that seems to be the aim of those who are plotting against the gentle lamb. Not just to destroy the lamb itself, it says with its fruit, with the sign of reproductive ability, because within the fruit is the seed. And if we have the seed, then we can reproduce the tree itself. And so if Messiah is the promised seed, who would be his fruit? His offspring. We are his offspring. And so they're not just trying to kill the lamb. The point is to kill the lamb and his offspring. It's an evil design to kill the aloof lamb. But in the Torah portion, it says just the opposite. It says the offspring of your aloof. What is he going to do with it? He will multiply it, and he will bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your land, your grain, your wine, your oil, the offspring of your aloof. Right? So embedded in there is the idea is that in the state of blessing, there will be a great reproduction from Messiah's work. And when they go into the land and they're living according to righteousness, then that offspring will greatly increase. Why? Because he said, I swore it to your forefathers. I swore it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in each one of those, we have some picture of the resurrection. So the offspring of the aloof lamb, we can see that they have a connection in their destiny, not just with the physical land itself, but with this spiritual land of resurrection. And as we look at this gentle lamb, we can see the plan was from the foundation of the world that this lamb would reproduce righteousness on the earth, but also there would be forces arrayed against him from the beginning who would try to cut off this plan, who would try to cut off this prophecy. So now we can go back up to Luke 11:49. It says, for this reason also the wisdom of God, which we just read about in the book of Proverbs, the wisdom of God said, I will send to them prophets and apostles, and some of them they will kill and they will persecute, so that the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of the world may be charged against this generation. So how could prophets and apostles be killed from the foundation of the world? Because at the foundation, there weren't any people yet. There were creatures that were created later, and there was man that was created on the sixth day. But how could the blood of the prophets and the apostles be shed since the foundation of the world? Well, again, sometimes we're trying to think in earth time as opposed to spiritual time and boundaries. But Revelation 13:8 gives us a hint. It says, all who dwell on earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb. Remember the aloof, the gentle lamb? The book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. So from the foundation of the world, I think we can see that Yeshua agreed that somehow in this divine plan, even though he was the gentle lamb, the aloof lamb, that his blood would be shed. And the prophets and the apostles have testified to this throughout our history. So it was predetermined that, again, their blood would be shed for the sake of revealing this plan. So that's just kind of a little embedded prophecy. We can find, sometimes when we see odd words, we have to stop and say, why is that odd word there? We don't see that written like that in a lot of places. But the fact that it's noteworthy, even to the rabbis, like, why are they using the word aloof in this sentence, which would refer to the gentle lamb? Because I think it's a signal to those who would come after, especially, and recognize the lamb, that this is a prophecy of him. So now, let's see. Let's go back to Revelation, and then we'll circle back from there, and we'll go back to Deuteronomy 7, chapter 7, so that we can again see these connections. And I think as many times as I've read this, we should be thoroughly familiar with it by the time we get done with the book. But there's so much prophecy just packed right here. Revelation 9:1, it says, the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven, which had fallen to the earth, and the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. And last night we brought out how the function of this action is, if it darkens the sun and it darkens the air, then in effect it's making people blind. Because without the light of the sun and without being able to see through the atmosphere, if it's turning the atmosphere dark, it's just like driving in fog. You can't see. You can't see where you're going. It causes confusion. And out of the smoke came forth locusts upon the earth, and power was given them as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were told that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment them for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. Okay, that's our second mention of scorpion. And in those days, men will seek death and will not find it. And they will long to die, and death flees from them. And the appearance of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads, as it were, crowns of gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. And they had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. And we can actually find this back in the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots of many horses rushing to battle. Okay, that's going to take us back to a first mention of the sound of chariots and many horses rushing to battle. It's going to take us back to the Exodus from Egypt. They have tails like scorpions and stings. There's the third mention of scorpions. And in their tails is the power to hurt men for 5 months. They have as king over them. Remember, they have a king. The angel of the abyss. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon. And in the Greek, he has the name Apollyon. The first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are still coming after. All right, let's look at Abaddon. These supernatural creatures are coming not just out of Sheol. There is an equivalent expression to Sheol, and it's mentioned in this passage as Abaddon. And we can see in Job 26:6 that they are equivalent expressions, but even in an equivalent expression, there's a little bit of difference between the two things, like a light and a lamp. They're equivalent, but they're not exactly, they're not identical. So with Sheol and Abaddon, they have an equivalency of expression. You could use one in place of the other, but in terms of figuring out what's the difference, we're not told exactly, but we can probably figure it out. It says in Job 26:6, naked is Sheol before him, and Abaddon has no covering. So naked and no covering are equivalent expressions, and that makes Sheol and Abdon equivalent expressions. So what would be the difference between Sheol and Abaddon? Well, they're probably describing 2 degrees of the same place, especially as we look at this passage in Revelation, because they're described as coming from a bottomless pit. We know that there were degrees of heaven. There were levels of heaven that Paul even writes about. And apparently there are degrees or levels of hell. The level of Sheol or hell that houses these bugs, these flying insects, is called Abdon. And he gives us a little detail that helps us think about it. He says it's a bottomless pit. It sounds like it's the deepest, because if there were levels, then obviously there would be a barrier or some sort of boundary where you would cross into another level. But this particular level or realm of Sheol is one that is bottomless. In other words, there's no end to it. And this might be where, in the rabbinic writings, sometimes they'll talk about certain types of sinners. It says they never come up from hell. Whatever it is, whatever that particular application is, it says this person is never going to be delivered. They'll be there forever. No end to it. But the thing that identifies both of them is that they're naked or they have no covering. Well, where's our first mention of that? We go back to the garden. All right, and so we see, again, everything is moving us back to understanding the resurrection. We know that with Adam and Eve, they realized after they rebelled that they were naked, that they had no covering, and therefore an artificial, not their natural covering, which was obedience. See, it was the moment that they disobeyed that they realized they were naked, that they had no covering. Oh my goodness, what have we done? And now you have to leave the garden, because you can't stay in the garden without a covering. And even in the physical earth, they needed a covering. And so without this access, we realized that somehow they had lost the ability to go into a level that is spiritual. And the book of Proverbs, again, where it's lining up and saying wisdom and knowledge and understanding, these are the way. This is going to lead you back so that you can engage and not fall to the seduction of the adulteress, so that you will not fall to the seduction that would take you away from your covenant, the covenant of your youth. For Adam and Eve, they could no longer access the spiritual realm because they didn't have a covering. They had now a nature that was partly hellish, partly evil. It left them naked. And so, again, from the beginning, there was a plan for Yeshua to come and to cover them with a covering, and that covering is righteousness. And so the Israelites in this Torah portion, they're going to be told that righteousness is very much a part of going back to the land, inheriting the land, staying in the land. But they're given a caution concerning the attribute of righteousness. And it's important because again, when we violate the rules of the garden, then you're kicked out of the garden. In the same way, in the physical land, if you continually violate the commandments, the covenant of your youth, eventually you will be kicked out of the land. So I say the physical land of Israel is the sister. We can look at the physical land and begin to kind of understand the spiritual land that he's trying to bring us back to simultaneously. So we need, if we want to get back to that spiritual land of the Garden of Israel, and in fact, in some of the rabbinic literature, the garden itself is called Israel. There's a reference to the 7 kings of Edom before there was a king in Israel. They think that king was Adam himself, that he was the first king. At any rate, the root of Avdon is avad, and I think it's really likely this is where the Christian church got, sometimes we use Christianese because that's what we grew up with. If you're in evangelical circles and somebody says, oh, he's just in the flesh, you know what they're talking about, even though a non-religious person would look at them and say, huh, aren't we all in the flesh? So we develop our little catchphrases to use. One of the phrases we often use is lost. Are you lost? Do you need salvation? And for Christians, if you say someone is lost, they know exactly what you're talking about. I don't know that you're going to hear that much within Judaism, but at least within Christian circles, they know what you're saying when you say someone is lost. Well, avad, the root of Abdon, it means not just destruction and ruin, it also means to be wandering or lost. So what are the types of creatures or people you would expect to find in Avdon? Those who have been destroyed and those who were wandering and lost. They did not have the garment of righteousness. And so these little creatures that are released from Avdon, the bottomless pit, we can see that they are a destructive power, so it's appropriate that that's their home, Avdon. But they're not just a destructive power that has been bound over to a certain time in history that Revelation is talking about. We can see when that time is reached that they are turned loose from this bottomless pit, from this probably lowest point of hell. These fearsome little creatures fly out, and they do have a king that they serve. But in this particular instance, they are being used by the Holy One. So remember, I don't know how many weeks ago I said we can make the devil do it. Yeshua made the devil do it. If he told a demon to go into a pig, then the demon had to go into a pig. If he told a demon to leave a human being, the demon had to leave a human being. In some cases, demons are more obedient than people, which is not a good thing. But even the demons, it says they tremble and they have to obey. So these tormenting creatures from the lowest level of hell, they're being released in order to accomplish something for the Holy One. They're being released to destroy. And there's specific people that they are being sent to torment and then to destroy. And we went over that in last night's lesson, how there was a twofold characteristic to these hornet-like creatures. First, they torture you, and then they exterminate you. It's a two-part process. So for 5 months, people are undergoing the torment and they're looking for destruction, but it won't come. They would rather short circuit and say, I don't want to do this for 5 months. I'd rather die. Well, they're so confused they can't die. And dying is not that confusing. If you're truly committed, dying is not hard. Right? It's the living. Sometimes it's much harder. But this destructive power of Avdon, the bottomless pit, is being harnessed, it's being directed by God himself. And when it describes the sight and the sound of these creatures, then it should remind us who celebrate Passover every year. And if we're reading the Torah portions, we read through the book of Exodus every year. So this is not an unfamiliar sound to us. The sound of horses and chariots rushing to battle, we get that. Because it's very much a part of our present. He will not allow us to forget those things. In fact, we keep Sukkot, he says, in remembrance of when we came out of Egypt. We can't forget the Passover. Why? Because it's part of this ultimate fulfillment that Revelation is talking about. Remember the Paleo Song of the Sea, where Moses and Miriam are singing, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea. So that gives us GPS. When we're reading this passage in Revelation with these strange creatures, then we should be going back into our Passover mindset and planting ourselves right back. Remember how he talks about the green things being destroyed? Well, the month of Aviv, or Nisan, when we have Passover, that is the green month. When the barley is Aviv, when it's ripe, when it's green. So when we see these judgments coming at a time of ultimate greenness in the land, we know that the initiation of it is occurring at Passover. So that takes us to this week's Torah portion again, in chapter 7, verse 23. It says, Hashem your God will deliver them before you and will confound them with great confusion until their destruction. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 points right here. If you want to write them down, if you're taking notes, I'm going to give you 3 points, and it'll just blow you away how accurately John's vision reflects this Torah portion. Hashem your God will deliver them before you and will confound them with great confusion until their destruction. All right, the first point there is going to be, number 1, confusion. They will be confused until their destruction. Confusion. Next, it says, he will deliver their kings into your hand, and you shall cause their name to perish from under the heavens. Okay, your number 2 is going to be deliver kings and cause their names to perish. So we've got confusion, we've got kings. Number 3, no man will stand up against you until you have destroyed them. So the third is going to be no one will stand up, or no man will stand up. And with each of those points, you can see that destruction is the point. Whether we're talking about the confusion before the destruction, delivering the kings to destruction, or that no one will be able to stand up until the destruction. 3 points. Right? Now, when we look at the first one, number 1, he says basically there's going to be great confusion. If I say that in Hebrew out of the text, I'm saying the hamam mehuma dola. And so it's a doubling of confusion, which is usually how it's translated even in English. The hamam Hamam is destruction in terms of confusion. Mehuma, all right, with confusion. It's like he's confusing them with confusion. But not just confusion in the second use, mehuma, he says mehuma dola, great confusion. So he is confusing them with great confusion. And that would actually be Strong's Hebrew 2000. If you want to look up Hamam and look at some of the other instances of how it's used, it can only be helpful. Right, so let's go back to the other text that we know we're supposed to be thinking about, which is in Exodus 14:23. Because how do we know we're supposed to be thinking about it? Because he gave us the actual sound of the torment as it came. And the sound was like horses and chariots prepared for battle. So we go back to Exodus where the horses and the chariots were prepared for battle against the Israelites. It says, then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. Now, read that carefully. I don't know what version you're reading in your Bible, but I'm going to read that again because there's going to be an interesting sentence coming up. It says, then the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. Well, who is them? That's not adding up right there. It says, at the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. That word there is Hamam. Just like the prophecy in our Torah portion that I'm going to bring them very confused, great confusion. It says he caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty. The chariot wheels got confused, and they didn't know which direction to go. And it's almost like the charioteers have no control over where those wheels are going. It's like a runaway car. And it says, so the Egyptians said, let us flee from Israel, for the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. Now, as you look at that text, as I'm reading it, it may not make a lot of sense, but if you will go back and you will read that text in NAS or probably in King James is pretty accurate in terms of not trying to fix the textual problems. And this is a textual problem because it creates a situation where there are Egyptians and then there are Egyptians. Why are the Egyptians saying that the Lord is fighting against the Egyptians? Why wouldn't they say he's fighting against us? Just like the beginning, it says the Egyptians took up the pursuit, and all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went in after them into the midst of the sea. Well, who is the them? It could be the Israelites. That could be part of it. But as we look at the rest of the passage, we see the Egyptians talking as though there are Egyptians other than themselves who are involved in this destruction. It's a really strange dialogue that the Egyptians appear to be having with themselves, as though there's an Egyptian people outside of who they are. There's the Egyptians, and then there seems to be Pharaoh's army. It just doesn't make any sense for them not to say the Lord is fighting for them against us, Why are they talking about Egyptians like something outside of themselves? Who could these other Egyptians be? We can suggest here that there may be a dark spiritual counterpart to the people that we know as the Egyptians. We know that there are principalities and powers in high places. And they seem to want to build high things, which we can certainly say of the Egyptians. They were the experts at building high things, but the building of the pyramids or the building of high mounds, towers, and so forth, it was not isolated to Egypt. It was simply the civilization like Babel in the time and the place that the scriptures were written. But we know in different times and different places, we have high places as far as the British Isles. We have them in North America. They're called the mound builders. We have them in Mexico. We have them in Central America. We have them in South America. A lot of them overrun by jungle, but if you follow archaeology at all, you know that there's tons of high places all over the earth that were built at some point in history. And it's like the Israelites were told in this Torah portion that your enemies, they have fortified their cities up to the heavens, that they're tapping into a dark spiritual power. And if you read some of the translations that archaeologists have of, say, the pyramids that were built in the Americas with the Aztecs and with the Incas and so forth, it was pretty evil what was going on. It was very evil what was going on in these high places, the sacrifice and so forth, and the idol worship that was going on. They were tapping into some evil forces. So with this strange dialogue, we're seeing the Egyptians, possibly they're inspired by evil forces. It's not just that the evil forces were present. We can see through Egyptian archaeology that they were actively tapping into these dark forces. That was part of their religion. It was embedded into their culture, was tapping into these forces. And, they even had a Book of the Dead. They were interested in an afterlife. Apparently they too believe in an afterlife, but in a twisted sort of way. But if they're tapping into these dark forces of Sheol or Abaddon, then what you have to realize is they have no covering. There's no atonement for that sort of spiritual nakedness. And so, as strong as these things are, what we have to remember is they will never inherit the land. They can only occupy it, which is what they're doing today. We would call them squatters, people who occupy places that have no legal right to be there. And so Moses warns the people in Deuteronomy, we're still in the Torah portion, Eikev, Deuteronomy 9, verse 1, he says, "Hear, O Israel." That should get their attention. "You are crossing over the Jordan today to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you." It says, great cities fortified to heaven. Well, how could a city fortify itself to heaven? Unless they were fortifying themselves with evil forces. He says, "A people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak?" Remember, number 3, Who can stand? He says, okay, you're Israelites. I don't want you saying who can stand. Because if you're asking the question, who can stand, then you're doubting the power of Yeshua's resurrection. Ultimately, remember the aloof lamb? You will be able to reproduce from that seed through his fruit. Don't say who can stand. He says, know therefore today that it is the Lord your God who is crossing over before you as a consuming fire. That should sound familiar from everything we've read in Revelation. He will destroy them, and he will subdue them before you so that you may drive them out and destroy them quickly. Remember Avdon, destruction? Just as the Lord has spoken to you. Do not say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them out before you. And here's the caution. He can destroy these dark forces. He can destroy these evil Egyptians. These forces that even go beyond a people and a place. They go into the depths of hell in terms of spiritual influences, and they try to build these high places. They're always trying to move up, but at the end, there's no bottom to where they go down. But for now, they're trying to build up. But he says, don't say in your heart when the Lord your God has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. If Israel, the physical Israel, the land, is that picture of the spiritual Israel, the spiritual garden, so that if we are to taste of resurrection, and therefore to inherit the land, to never be driven off of it again, to make our days long, it says, to lengthen your days. If you lengthen your days, you're moving into eternity. But you cannot say, when you realize you have the clothes of resurrection, which are the clothes of Yeshua, you cannot say, because of my righteousness, the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. You cannot look back at your list of good deeds and say, this is why I earned the resurrection. This is how I earned my place in the lower garden. You can't say that. So even from the beginning, Moses is telling them, don't sit around counting up your mitzvot. Don't sit around trying to figure out how elaborate your outfit is. Because your righteousness is not the garment by which you enter the land. It's not in the merit of your own righteousness. Now, can your reward have something to do with the good deeds you did on earth? Absolutely. In Revelation, it says they follow you. Well, if they're following you, your good deeds could not possibly be out ahead of you. Yeshua is the one who went ahead of you. And Moses says, never say because of my righteousness am I possessing this land. Never say because of my righteousness I am saved. I am no longer wandering and lost in Sheol. It's because of Yeshua's righteousness that you can be brought in to possess the land. Nevertheless, if we can accept that it's not our righteousness, that there is an aloof lamb who will one day not appear to us as aloof or gentle, it will be the wrath of the lamb. And Moses prophesies of the wrath of the lamb. And he says a fire from heaven is going to destroy the sons of the Anakim, which we can see the destruction in Revelation. It's destroying those foundations of wickedness that to us seem too strong to defeat. Can you imagine the power it would take to defeat every wicked government, every wicked politician, every wicked military, every wicked religion? when you think of all the mountains and caves where those things are hiding, it seems impossible. And that's what Moses says. You can't be discouraged just because it looks like their cities are fortified up to heaven, because the source of their strength is evil, principalities and powers. The giants, the Anakim, they were the offspring, remember, it's understood, of the rebellious angels who challenged the authority of the holy ones. And they said, you know what? You created these human beings. They're weak, they're faulty, and they're going to be unable to overcome the lusts of their soul. And in order to prove to God that he was wrong to create them, they go down and immediately, what are they consumed with? Human lust. And they find out too late that, oh wow, Elohim was right after all. And it says that they sinned more grievously than the human beings, which led the Israelites to wonder, after seeing these giants in the land and bringing back these huge supernatural looking grapes, like, hey, if the giants couldn't overcome the lust of the soul, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect, if they couldn't even do it, how can we? How can we ever enter in? We cannot overcome any more than those giants could overcome. But the whole message of Revelation is he who overcomes, he who overcomes, he who overcomes. How can you overcome? Through the righteousness of the aloof lamb, the gentle lamb, Yeshua. And so when we finally see the saints overcoming to inherit the physical land of Israel, it's a sign that the righteousness of Yeshua has clothed them in such a way that their citizenship in the garden is being restored. And they got a little taste, the Israelites got a little taste of these garments, these special garments, and we read about it in Deuteronomy 8, 3-4. It says, he humbled you and let you be hungry. Can you overcome the desire of the soul, one of which is hunger? And fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. And this is exactly the temptation of Yeshua. He's given time, this 40 days, just like they had 40 years, he's given 40 days in the wilderness. And his temptations involve the same temptations. It has to do with the food and the water. And I want a position higher than I have right now. Bowing down and worshiping pagan gods. So we have 3 symbolic tests of Yeshua that address basically the entirety of the 40 years of the temptations and the tests that Israel had to endure. And each time he quotes the word back to the enemy, but he straightens the word. All the serpent can do is twist it. Remember, when a snake wants to get balance, it twists. It can never be straight. But Yeshua gives the straight word, and he demonstrates to us that we can overcome the desires of the soul, of the nefesh, appetite, desire, emotion, intellect. And we do it by quoting the word accurately and then obeying the word. Yeshua says, I'm the bread of heaven. I'm that manna. And if I receive that manna from heaven and I obey that manna from heaven, Yeshua, then I can overcome the world. And what am I doing? I am accepting that garment of salvation that Yeshua gave me. And it's a garment that will not wear out. And I just want to requote, even though I did in class last night, because he's talking about how your garments didn't wear out in the wilderness. How could they not wear out? Because he was clothing you with Yeshua's righteousness. And as long as you would obey and not rebel, you're good to go. But you start rebelling and complaining and speaking against the straight word and twisting the word, then you're going to die in the wilderness. And it says these, as it concerns these garments that they wore that did not wear out in the wilderness, it was a result of the effects of being in the clouds of glory. Remember when they entered into Sukkot, after they left Egypt at Passover, the rabbis say they entered into clouds of glory. It's also called Sukkot of glory because of the place. And Rashi says that the clouds of glory would rub their clothes, like clean their clothes at all times, and press them, making them look like freshly pressed garments. It says their young too, as they would grow, their clothing would grow with them. And so it's no wonder that we get to the book of Matthew and we see Yeshua in the context of the clouds of glory, having that garment of righteousness that he could cover Israel with. It says he was transfigured before them in Matthew 17:2. He was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments, see in Revelation, it's blocking the sun. The judgment is blocking the sun. But with Yeshua, it says his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. Remember, the Torah is a light, the commandment is a lamp. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Peter said to Yeshua, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So automatically, Peter is thinking Sukkot. Why is he thinking Sukkot? While he was still speaking, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice out of the cloud said, this is my beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Shema. Shema Yisrael. Listen to him. He was with you in the wilderness. He overshadowed you in the wilderness. He spoke to you in the wilderness. And it's good to be there, as long as the cloud is there. It says that Yeshua was transfigured. If we are walking in the clouds, if we are walking in the Sukkot of glory, then it should transfigure us. It should never be that the sun is darkened for us or that the air is darkened for us. Instead, this particular cloud doesn't obscure your vision. It makes things brighter. It says it becomes as white as light. And it's there that we can see Yeshua shining like the sun. And so there's a contrast between Sukkot of glory, or the clouds of glory, and those who would descend to Sheol or Abaddon, or those who would be tormented by these creatures from Sheol or Abaddon. What we have to remember, though, is we can never say that it's our righteousness. It's only through the atoning blood of the aloof lamb who was slain, it says, from the foundation of the world, that our own nakedness could be covered. And we could be delivered from Sheol or delivered from Abaddon in order to inherit the land, in order to inherit a better resurrection. And let's see, how are we doing on time? Well, we just went over on time. Okay, I gave you 3 things, so I'm going to go ahead and finish that out. All right, we see an Egyptian-like army that has been bound from a previous time until the day of torments. And so just as the Hammam, the confusion bogged down the chariot wheels and misdirected the chariot wheels of the Egyptian army, we see that confusion enters into the wicked and they seek death, but they can't find it. Secondly, the number 2, remember, was the kings. And it said, I will deliver these kings into your hands, and you shall cause their name to perish from under the heavens. As we're reading through the Revelation texts, it mentions the king of the abyss called Abaddon. And we know that these creatures do not have the power to torment those who were sealed. There's a distinction. And so this destructive army is actually being delivered over for the good of Israel. It's destroying the enemies of Israel. It's tormenting them. And again, we see the stars that will fall from heaven. And sometimes we've got the Abrahamic stars, which are true witnesses. But we also have other stars and planets that are understood as being at least metaphoric of these spiritual beings that do have some authority. They have boundaries that are set for them according to the stars or the planets that they would have authority over. And frequently you can see in pagan mythology, they're actually named for those things. So probably I would say this is where the pagan corruptions of worshiping planets and stars arose. They warped the sign into the substance. We know that planets and stars and sun and so forth, these things are signs, but they're not the substance. They are not the God himself, but they have been turned into gods and demigods by a perverse and twisted people. But at the time of the destruction, we can see that even these evil entities can be forced to execute destruction upon their own. And remember, it was a rebellious house that Isaiah talked about. And there was a quote from Ezekiel last night that referred to the rebels within Israel. Here, though, we can see that not only has the rebellious house of Israel, its destruction or its sealing over has occurred, but now it's extending even out to the nations, to the rebels among the nations. So the point is to destroy the rebels. And I believe, if I remember correctly, when astrologers start talking about the way the stars are composed or organized or whatever, they call these signs of the zodiac houses. Isaiah calls them a rebellious house. So there's judgment against this rebellious house. And remember, Moses says, no man will stand up against you until you have destroyed them. So we've got here the kings of the earth wiping out their names in the Torah portion. And we have that they're not going to be able to stand before you in this destruction. So let's go to Revelation 6:15 again. It says, then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand. So you see the fulfillment right here in Revelation of what Moses prophesied, that the kings of the earth are going to have to acknowledge that they cannot stand against the throne, the Lamb, Israel. And again, it said, remember, you shall cause their name to perish from under the heavens. No man will stand up against you until you have destroyed them all. And so as we're reading the book of Revelation, we realize we're rereading Torah portions, except we're reading how they've been applied or will be applied at a future time. So that gives you it gives you out of those 3 points the idea there of the confusion, the idea of the kings and causing their names to perish, and again, that they're not going to be able to stand. There is nothing that can stand between the saints retaking Israel, that is, being able to enter into the garden and to prolong their days when they take on the covering, the garments of righteousness that don't wear out of Yeshua. So these so-called gods and demigods that the nations rely upon, their rebellion and this strange turn of events, they are adversaries of the Holy One. They are rebels against the Holy One, yet they are going to become the very instruments that destroy their own people. Those who are committed to worshiping them, they're all going to suffer the same fate. They're all going to be bound over to Sheol. But again, with Deuteronomy, he is talking about prophecy, but because it's so far in the future, I think it's been hard to match up what we read in prophecy, at least in terms of the Torah, to the book of Revelation, because they're the book apart. We've got the Torah at the beginning, we've got Revelation at the end, but we're told that he declares the end from the beginning. So as we're just taking this one passage that we've been over, I think at least 4 weeks we've spent on this passage in some way, we can see that the story keeps going on as we move closer and closer to the end of the Torah. In fact, there's a lot more information as we read this Torah portion and the Song of Moses, and then we go back to the book of Revelation, and we can see more prophecy from the Song of Moses in the book of Revelation. So, he will confuse the enemy and blind them. He will cut off their fruit. Remember, the idea is these creatures make you impotent. You cannot bear fruit. They blind you. They make you impotent. Why? Because their vow was, we will cut off the aloof lamb, the gentle lamb. And because their design was to destroy Yeshua, instead, these flying bugs, whatever they are being sent to execute that same judgment upon the kings of the earth. But not just the kings, it says all the way down to the bondservant. Whether slave or free, it doesn't matter. If by your behavior or by your words, it's been your aim to destroy Yeshua and to destroy his seed after him, because it's promised in this Torah portion that I will bless those descendants. I will bless the descendants of the aloof. Then He will send creatures to blind you, confuse you, where you don't even know how to die. And those things, those strongholds that you have worshiped, the kings of the earth, whatever those strongholds may have been, you will see them hiding and pleading for death. And no man can stand against it. Nobody. And that's exactly what Moses says. No man will stand up against you until you have destroyed them. That's exactly what John says, that the wicked are saying, who can stand? Okay, we'll stop it right there.